education at Teachers College, Columbia University, and a nationally acclaimed expert on urban public education. He also oversees school initiatives, secondary school initiatives, at the Urban Science Education Center. Dr. Emdin has a PhD in urban education with a concentration in mathematics, science, and technology from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He holds master's degrees in natural sciences and education administration. And he has bachelor degrees from Lehman College in physical anthropology, biology, and chemistry. Dr. Emdin's professional and scholastic accomplishments are notable. He was the co-author of the proposal that established the Marie Curie School in the Bronx, New York, and is currently a consultant and researcher for projects funded by the National Science Foundation. Dr. Emdin engages public dialogue through lectures that challenge and activate audiences. Subjects such as Obama effect on urban education and improving STEM education offer relevant insight and inspire conversation. Because of this unique scholarship and specialized research, Dr. Emdin receives frequent invitations for television appearances and has been a guest on programs airing on ABC, NBC, CBS, and CNN. He is also author of the book, Urban Science Education for the Hip-Hop Generation, of which the first 20 who came today get a free copy. I think you know who you are. You should have a coupon to redeem at the end of the presentation. On a more personal front, I had the pleasure of hearing Dr. Emdin at the CI Water Symposium in September at the University of Utah. My mom, who doesn't know a whole lot about science or education except cheering my brothers and I on through public education, still talks about Dr. Emdin's presentation and the impact that it had on her. And I came back to the University of Wyoming exclaiming that we had to bring him here. So the Science and Math Teaching Center, the Social Justice Research Center, and Wyoming EPSCoR have teamed together to bring Dr. Chris Emdin to the University of Wyoming to engage and challenge us, not only how to get kids to love science, yet also our students, who are often kid-like, right? Adults, and certainly the public. Please join me. And before we do warmly welcome Dr. Emdin, let me just remind you that afterwards there will be a reception right outside where we will have the chance to chat with Dr. Emdin. But please, let's warmly welcome Dr. Emdin to the very science.
Thank you so much. My mom would be proud. It's an honor to be here with you today, and just to share some insight on my work and my research. I know the billing was, ways to get kids engaged in science, and I will definitely talk about ways to get engaged kids in science. But every opportunity that I have to engage with a public about science and about education, I sort of have to take my own sort of personal narrative and my own personal motivations into consideration and share those as well. So you'll get what you're supposed to be here for, but you get a whole dose of Chris at the same time. Science education, science or education, science and education. Are there points of connection? Absolutely yes. You have to have an education to be a successful scientist, yes. But oftentimes, what I find in my research across the country, and sometimes in some instances across the globe, has been that in the countries that have been most successful, or least successful rather, in teaching science, there has been a war between science and education. Meaning the structures of science instruction and what we know makes sense to make people be interested in schooling are completely at odds. And my work, although it's been described as folks as innovative or, groundbreaking, and I accept it all. I'm like, dude, thanks. In reality, to me and to many folks who are in the trenches, in classrooms, may not necessarily be groundbreaking. It really is just what makes sense. And so I've gone through a decade of research, literally as a teacher, as a researcher, traveling the country, going through hours and hours of videotape, trying to find out ways to get youth to be engaged in science again. And at the end of it all, when we drill it down to the most simple, basic elements, I'm like, man, I didn't have to do all this research. It's just what makes sense. Now, what makes sense has to be sort of quantified and qualified through research. And so I'll talk about the research that guides that. But really, it just makes sense. Now, I also always give a disclaimer. At some point during this conversation, I will say something to offend you. You'll be like, what? How dare he? Once that happens, walk out, take a breather, then come back. And I expect you to be offended because my charge in talking about science education is to challenge. And if it ends up being the whole entire time a complete love fest, then I haven't done my job. So I am here so you can hate me, then love me, and perhaps hate me again. It's okay. I'm okay with it. So now let's get into it. You ready? Not good enough. Are we ready to go? Yeah. Let's engage in this journey. I will start off by talking about this picture behind me. And that picture are 3 scientists. Can anybody identify any of those scientists? Probably not. It's fine. And that's part of the reason why science is so huge, right? Because we've lost the idea of like a science hero. You know, there was a time where scientists were like celebrities. Like a scientist would walk around campus, they'd be like, oh my gosh, it's him, right? But we've lost the idea of the science hero. That's a whole other conversation. But these are 3 scientists. They are at MIT, and one of them has a PhD. The other has an MS, and one is an MC. This is a research scientist. One is her research assistant. And this guy here is a rapper. What? A rapper? Yeah, a rapper. That guy is GZA from the rap group Wu-Tang Clan. And a lot of folks have heard about Wu-Tang, right? And you're like, what the heck is GZA doing hanging out with scientists? So I'll tell you a story. GZA went through school. 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, asked tons of questions, was really inquisitive. 4th grade, first exam, still asked some questions, not quite as inquisitive. 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, got to 10th grade, and he always loved science, but he could never find a way to turn onto it in the school. The teachers never asked the right questions. He felt like he just couldn't fit. In fact, I wrote a rap about just his experience in schools after he described it to me. In this amazing conversation I got to have with him and Neil deGrasse Tyson. And the rap goes, so I sit in the back of the science class unconscious because everything that my teacher's spitting is nonsense. I wanted to raise my hand to avoid the conflict, but if I raise my hand, I'm not the one he's going to pick. So I sit here, my mind in another place. I'm rapping to myself in a different time, different place. Displaced, because I'm at a different pace. I can't wait for this bell so I can make my escape. And that narrative was GZA's narrative. But interestingly enough, even though we're talking through hip-hop, that narrative is not just his. It's of millions of youth across the United States who all feel like they just can't key in. So what's he doing with the scientists? He actually dropped out of school in the 10th grade. And he was looking for something to turn him on again and make him feel passionate again. And you know what that thing was? Hip-hop. So he starts a group and he becomes world famous. He becomes a millionaire. He travels the globe. He meets people. And then all of a sudden, a couple of albums later, he's like, man, I love hip-hop, but you know what I really, really loved? Science. I loved asking questions and not knowing the answers, but people guiding me through it, and I never got it. So he used his fame and his connections to go back and find a science lab and learn from the scientist. And that story is so beautiful to me, but at the same time, it's so disheartening. Why? Because there are millions of young people who don't have the affluence or the wealth or the connections to be able to find a path back towards science. That once they leave, it's over. So the question now is, and why we're here today is, how do we get a GZA in Brooklyn, New York, or Staten Island, New York, who is ostracized from science, or that kid in a school in Wyoming who's ostracized from science to reconnect back? I would argue that you can use hip-hop. But beyond that, I would argue that we have to reframe the way we look at science education. So can we move on? Just some stats. Fewer than 40% of students who enter college as STEM majors complete a STEM degree. Wow. Nearly 60% of all U.S. students lack the math skills to go into STEM. Wow. Only 31% of 8th graders are proficient in science, with low-income students 3 times more likely to achieve proficiency in science. You're not wowed? Wow. Only 33% of 8th graders are interested in STEM majors, and only 6% of high school seniors will get a bachelor's degree in the STEM field. Wow. The U.S. is ranked 27th out of 29 for the rate of STEM bachelor's degrees awarded in developing countries, and although the U.S. 4th graders score well against international, and I skipped the disclaimer because it was too large, at 4th graders they score well internationally, but by the time they reach the 11th and 12th grade, it's completely reversed. Whose fault is that? And I know that's said tongue-in-cheek, but some people say that. Some people say that it's because they don't want to learn. They don't care. And there's some more, I just won't even go through these because it's just too depressing, and it will just be wowing, all right? So before we go further, I want to start with an analogy because I'm an MC and we speak an analogy, right? And the idea is, let's look, any biologists in here? Co-biologists, okay, biologists, I'm talking right to you. Let's say you have a stem of a plant. And so, you know, nice green, fleshy plant. And you take that stem off and it just sits there, right? And you want it to grow a fruit. By breaking it off from its root and keeping the stem, can it ever bear fruit? No. A stem without any root, it just can't bear fruit. Now, what we could do is we could say, all right, well, let's try to manipulate some variables here. Let's take that stem, and although it's not connected to a root, let's wrap it up in a napkin. And if that napkin is doused in water, we can wrap it in the water, and then we can give the right amount of light, and will it bear fruit? No. It may stay alive for a little while longer than it would have initially, but it will never bear fruit. A stem with no root bears no fruit. Repeat after me. A stem with no root bears no fruit. And from now on, whenever I say a stem with no root, I want you to say, bears no fruit. Now, we talked about a stem without a root, and it can't ever bear fruit. But let's look at STEM. What does STEM stand for? Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. STEM without a root. Well, you're catching on. And now, what's the fruit? The fruit is those statistics we talked about earlier. The fact that kids aren't scoring well. They're doing well in 4th grade and not 12th grade. We cannot ever reverse that tide unless we understand that STEM needs a root. So now, let's talk about the root. Where do you find the root of a plant? In the ground. That's a stem. That's a root. It's in the ground. Now, what are some characteristics of the ground where you find that root? It's what? It's warm. Absolutely is warm. Remember, warm. Usually it is, depending on what time of this year, but yeah, it's warm. What else about it? It's nutrient rich. Oh my gosh, you know you got some scientists when you hear nutrient rich, right? It's nutrient rich. It's under the ground, isn't it? And it's also dirty. It's uncomfortable. He was like, I was saying that. No one got the answer, and I knew that. Next time I'm going right to you, man, right? It's nutrient rich, yes, right? And it's the seedbed for the growth. But at the same time that it's nutrient rich, it's also underground and it's also dirty. Meaning that if I'm going to plant, I have to dig in the dirt. And if I dig in the dirt, my fingernails will get dirty, it's uncomfortable, but it's a necessary evil. No? If you really want to bear fruit, you've got to plant something. Take that analogy and let's connect that to STEM education. In order for us to be able to move the agenda forward and get kids interested in science again, we have to go into the underground, to the dirt. Now, what's the dirt? The dirt is all the lies and distortions that we've told ourselves for a very long time about the ability of young people to be successful in science. The dirt is the exclusivity that comes with science. That because we are scientists, we have an ego. We have a hill up on high, and no one else has the intelligence that we have. That's all dirt. And beyond the dirt, it's also culture. That hip-hop stuff. You know, the cursing and the violence It's dirty and uncomfortable. But I would argue that in order to go into transforming STEM education, we have to go into the dirt. Because the dirt is nutrient rich. Hip-hop is the most consumed cultural phenomenon ever created by the United States. Do you realize that? Do you realize that the United States uses hip-hop culture in countries that don't like the US as a way to appease the folks who are against us? They literally play hip-hop. Like, we're not so bad. We created hip-hop. Did you realize that most of the consumers of hip-hop culture are actually not who we think the consumers are? Most of the consumers of hip-hop culture are not black kids in urban neighborhoods. They are white kids in suburban and rural neighborhoods. That an artifact created in one populace is consumed by everyone, globally. If something has that power, and we have an issue as far as connecting students to science, then I would argue that what has the most powerful cultural phenomena, that powerful cultural phenomena has to be able to be used to connect youth back to the discipline. This is why GZA is actually doing his next album all on science. The album is called Dark Matter. And the entire album is about science topics. That's how you change the tide. That's why when I teach Newton's laws of motion, it's not, hey guys, Newton's laws of motion are 3 rules and principles that guide what we do. We don't need science being from the dude from the Clear Eyes commercial. It has to get the cool factor of that, right? You have to be able to say, yo, I'm a physicist, lyricist, spitting this ridiculousness, so witness the ignorance I dismiss. Newton's laws of motion is the topic of the course because things in motion stay in motion unless they hit an unbalanced force. And next up's the second law of situation and summation, force equals mass times acceleration. And that's the second law that Newton foresaw. And if you want more, then the third law is in store. So every force has an opposite force and every action has an equal plus opposite reaction. The sum of all objects at rest is 0. That's the object is no longer relaxing. I mean in motion, that's changing location. Till it hits traction, the coefficient of friction. And then it all comes to a full stop. And there goes Newton's laws over hip-hop. But hold up, I'm off Newton. I'm on an Einstein. I like Einstein because Einstein's mind is like mine. His formula was E equals MC squared, which is weird because me is your favorite MC squared, right? Thank you. I take applause, right? And donations for my album, I'm joking, right? But my concept is that what we perceive as being anti-intellectual very well has the tools to become hyper-intellectual. It also has the potential to be able to connect to the discipline. And we can use that to infiltrate the minds of a whole new generation so they can associate science with what they like, associate science with what they love, associate STEM with a cultural phenomenon that's infiltrated young people across the globe. Isn't that what we want? So let's proceed, because we know a STEM with no root. I was just checking to see if you were still with me. About half of you were. The rest of you would flunk the class. Right? So now let's talk about this idea of the policies of exclusion. Why kids don't do well in science. One, the policies of exclusion, it means that there's a coercive means to exclude populations from domains that leads to power and possibilities. And how that comes forth is through this idea of the discourse and the language that is associated with science. How many people in here have said at some point in their life, I'm smart, but I'm not good in science? You can be honest. We got 1, 2, 3. Raise it higher. Be proud. Just want to make a point, right? Why do you think that's the case? That it's become a part of our national discourse for people to be comfortable with saying, I'm not good in science. For them to say, you know what, I'm a smart person, but I'm not good in science. That's not a function of the discipline. That's a function of what we've created in the mindset of a new generation. Half of the folks in here who said that are the students. This goes beyond how we teach science better. It goes beyond how can I deliver my instruction, because that is important, right? The content and the formulas do count, but you can never, ever, ever get to the formulas and the instruction unless you attack the fact that people are comfortable to say, I'm not good in science. We got to change the narrative. And part of what we're going to talk about today is how do we change that narrative? The second thing, there are no science heroes. Rappers are heroes. Politicians are heroes. Scientists are geeks. There's a study that's been done 1,000,001 times where people say, you know what? Every person in here, if you have a piece of paper out, I won't look, just as I'm talking, draw a picture of a scientist. Really quickly, draw a picture of a scientist. And I'm no magician, but I can tell you what at least 95% of the population here has drawn. A dude with crazy hair, with thick glasses, pretty awkward and dorky, in a white lab coat. Am I right? I should have bet on it, right? Why we have to be able to restore not only the fact that they have the discourse of science, but the cool factor of science. No scientist looks like that. Do you know in science labs people play music? Do you know that in science labs you can wear whatever you want as long as you have the protective gear? No one knows that. We have to reintroduce a new discourse to science, right? Thirdly, do you ever see science posters? You're worried about your third grader, your fourth grader being interested in science? Half the battle is just having a science hero poster in your room or in your home, right? We have everything but. Nowhere is there that part of the discourse and the lexicon, all right? So now I'm going to talk about how you do these things. I don't want to just play out the problems. I want to step into some solutions. Because we know for right now that a stem with no root. You're still with me. I love it. So now Einstein, one of the most brilliant scientists of our time, he's identified as coming up with one of the most brilliant formulas. He's actually one of my heroes. It's between Einstein and Galileo. I can't pick one. You know, it's like so tough. He's like, you really want to pick? I'm like, yeah, right? So here's Einstein, and this is what at the crux of what I've introduced so far is that wherever a story comes from, whether it's a myth or a memory, the retelling of the story exemplifies the making of a connection from one pattern to another. A translation in which a narrative becomes a parable, and in a parable somehow becomes some truth. This guides all the incidents of everyday life. A distortion becomes a myth becomes a narrative becomes a truth. When you think Einstein, what do you think? Brilliant, weird, maybe not. You know, you think of his formulas, but that wasn't Einstein. This was Einstein. A total, like, cool, like, dweeb dude, you know, right? Somebody who exhibited skills that we don't check for in science classrooms. Einstein was science-minded. Oh, I skipped a slide. Einstein exhibited certain skills and characteristics and dispositions that we don't check for. Einstein was anti-mathematical in many respects until he understood the larger phenomenon and connected it back to science. Einstein discovered or came upon the theory of relativity by imagining himself in outer space riding a light beam. Isn't that friggin' dope? Like, think about that, right? Like, so it wasn't really the formula, right? The formula came after, right? The mathematical underpinning came later. The initial thing was, I am imagining myself riding a light beam in outer space. How often do you connect science to an imagination exercise? How many teachers do we have here? Aspiring teachers. When aspiring teachers, I'll talk to teachers first. If you're in any science classroom and you don't create this space for the students to sit there and just think and close their eyes and imagine, you're not doing your job right. And for those of you who are going into the classroom, part and parcel of science is engaging in imagination exercises, thinking about possibilities that no longer exist, because that's how you change the frame of science. When students start realizing that if I think deeply and make rare connections in scientific, we change the game. We change the game. Fleming discovered penicillin by initially playing around in petri dishes, and he had a cold, and some snot from his nose fell into the petri dish, and he sort of played in it. Pretty disgusting, I know. Incubated it, noticed there were different colors, and was like, whoa, something weird's going on here. And it's also kind of like a joke, like Phlegm. Sorry, it's like my favorite joke, right? But that process, well, one, he was a little bit of a geek and a dweeb, right? But also he was drawing images in the petri dish. That's an artistic-minded person, right? How often do we assess scientists by their artistic ability? And how often do we show students who exhibit artistic activity and funnel them out of science? You're really imaginative. That was a great picture, a great model. you'd be a wonderful artist. When what we're doing really is creating a certain type of scientist. People always clamor about, in the United States, we don't create enough science, we don't create enough science, we don't create enough scientists. You go to higher education, a lot of scientists get imported from other places across the globe, right? And you wonder, why is that happening? Well, the reason why that's happening is because the innovators in science are oftentimes still here. The fact makers are across the globe. But we need the fact makers to combine with the artistic folks in order to move the scientific agenda forward. We've created a system in the United States where we're only focused on creating a mechanistic scientist. And a mechanistic scientist can't sustain the discipline. Anybody can follow orders. It's easy. If I know the process and you tell me the steps to follow, I can do that. I don't need a PhD to follow orders. Right? But I need imagination to create the new orders. And that's how you move science forward. So right now, how do we get these kids to love science? I argue that you need gamification, new heroes, science-mindedness, social media, and hip-hop. I'm going to rest out really quickly on social media. And I want to do an experiment really quickly. Who here is on Twitter? Now, if you're on Twitter and you're under 25, put your hand up. Looks like the same darn people. Not a coincidence, right? I argue that social media is the new way to get a new generation engaged in science, particularly Twitter. Why Twitter? Because you have a whole bunch of scientists and educators from across the globe who are sharing their everyday practices. And so science becomes relevant if you can follow the great thinkers of our time. Part of the flaw of science education in the United States is that we teach all history. No one teaches the present. I'll say that again. We teach all history, and no one teaches the present. Students think that science ended a long time ago, and they just have to memorize all of it. And that's part of the reason why they don't like the discipline. But if we can connect what we're doing to what's going on every day, we open up new possibilities. And on Twitter, every single day, people are innovating new practices scientifically, and they're on there. So what we have to do as scientists and educators, as parents, to get kids engaged, is to actually infiltrate that space. Infiltrate that space and tag on to the intellectual discourse that's now and evolving. And then introduce young people to that discourse as well. It becomes the conduit. We had an opportunity to do this with Facebook. We blew it, educators. Do you realize that? We had the opportunity to identify a social practice before it was popular, to learn how it works, to use it in classrooms educationally and in a constructive fashion. We didn't, and so youth took it and ran with it. And then they started posting like booty videos, right? And it got to the point where it got so horrific that schools started shutting down Facebook, like no Facebook in schools. It's just too much. That wasn't a function of the young people or the social media network. It was a function of educators not being willing to understand the potential of a new tool and to utilize that in a constructive fashion. And now it's become unbridled. Twitter has the same potential. Get on it. Social media. All right? Because a stem with no root. We're doing great on timing, but it's going by so much quicker than I thought. I'll skip this because we're running out of time. So pretty much the formula boils down to this, and this is how we use hip-hop. So hip-hop exists, and we have marginalized youth, whether they be kids who are creating hip-hop or not, or whether or not they're Aborigine youth, or they're indigenous youth, or they're socioeconomically deprived youth, and we have the culture of science. And the culture of science and the culture of youth are oftentimes at odds. Do we all understand that so far? Are we okay with that so far? I don't have to keep beating that up, do I? So let's talk about the basic formula for transforming science education. Kids love hip-hop. Very simple. Kids hate school. There's a culture of science. There's a culture of young people. I'll go back a little bit. Kids really hate school. Kids really love hip-hop. In order to transform science education, there's this little space in between there. That's an intersection between the culture of youth and the culture of science. And what we want to do is to be able to realize that they do love science. Did you know that? All the people in here are saying, I'm really smart, but I don't like science, actually inherently love science. They just don't know it yet. And then find ways to permeate that. So how do you permeate that? How do you let people understand that they know science. I'm going to skip because I always over-prepare. And we have to delve into this idea of science-mindedness. Everybody repeat after me, science-mindedness. Again, science-mindedness. Doesn't it sound good? Let's say it again, science-mindedness. Let's move from focusing on science, education, and facts and formulas into this notion of science-mindedness. What is science-mindedness? Science-mindedness are all the skills, dispositions, traits, and attributes of the most brilliant scientists of our time. And I have combed through the literature about what these attributes, skills, and dispositions are. And what I have found is that most of them have nothing at all to do with the practice of science. In fact, the science-mindedness skills of the most prolific scientists are keen observation skills, being able to sit and watch and painstaking detail and identify things. What does a field scientist do? They sit there and they look. And then after they finish looking, they look some more. Then after that, they continue to look. And then they notice one thing that seems to be an anomaly. And that's the moment that they capture it down, and that's what a field scientist does. That in itself is not a formula. That is a mindedness skill. It's observation. Being a skeptic. Every 14-year-old is a skeptic. I just don't believe you. That's what's going to happen. No, it's not. Being anti-authoritarian. Every adolescent is anti-authoritarian. Every adolescent can observe. That they give information that's evidence-based. I believe this because we don't talk about why it's good evidence or not, but it's evidence-based. It's curiosity. Every 2-year-old is curious. You ever heard the idea of the terrible twos? Why do they call it the terrible twos? Because they keep asking why. Right? Creativity. Just different ways of thinking. And when we think about all these things, guess what? We all do them every single day. Don't you? And so the work for us as educators and as adults and as teachers and future teachers is to be able to show young people who believe they can't do well in science that their everyday practices is connected back to science. They have to identify what the science-mindedness skills are and name them as scientific. That when a student goes into my classroom and he starts doodling while I am teaching, and there's a pattern in it, I don't say you're in trouble and you go to the principal. I say, oh my gosh, look at the detail in that. And look how imaginative you are. Did you realize that that's a science-mindedness skill? That when the kid is outside in the lunchroom and he's drifting out in outer space and just staring at the squirrel hopping all around, I say, oh my gosh, you are so imaginative and curious. That's an amazing science-mindedness skill. The same mechanism that we've used to ostracize young people from science, which is in the naming and their thinking that they can't do well in the discipline, is the anchor through which we can re-invite them to the discipline. Now, I'm not saying that that's all it is. Once you people see themselves as being able to envision new possibilities, guess what happens? They rise up to the expectation. 100 students in the Bronx, New York. Graduation rates hover around 64% in this borough. The Bronx is one of the poorest urban areas in the United States. We start a new school. We want to make scientists. The kids come in every day, and we tell them, you're a scientist. In the physics class, they draw, we say, that's scientific. They rap, we say, that's extremely scientific, what it actually is. In fact, I've never identified any other group of people who exhibit more science-mindedness skills than rappers. Like Jay-Z once dissed Nas, and he said, dog, you never lived it, you witnessed it from your folks' pad, you scribbled in a notepad, and you created your life. Which means that this guy never lived in the streets. He sat on a windowsill. And he crafted a narrative with metaphor and an analogy, and it was so vivid that everybody believed that was his life. That's scientific, right? Metaphor and analogy. The best rappers do what? They don't just say raps. They say it is like, and it's connected to, and they compare things and contrast things, and they take seemingly disparate ideas and find the connections and then create them in rhyme with this vivid, imaginative talent. All rappers are scientists. And so once we begin doing this and we get them to see themselves as scientists, things happen. So back to the school. All these kids came out of nowhere, supposed to graduate. All of a sudden they started seeing themselves as scientific. Guess what happens? Attendance goes from 60-something% to about 90%. What? Why the heck are these kids coming to school? Right? Because it's fun. Because we write raps in our science class. Because we draw in our science class. Because we tell them every day you're brilliant and you're a scientist. They believe it. All right, let's see what happens. They start passing standardized exams. What the heck? Right? They start graduating. They start declaring science majors. And Edmund Ajampong graduates from SUNY Plattsburgh with a 3.89 GPA as a biochemist, and he's a published author, and he gets accepted into a master's program at Columbia University. And he did this coming into school in the beginning, being the one kid in class. When I wanted him to be quiet, he would just yell out the word crack just to drive me crazy. I'm teaching, and I'm describing the lesson, and you know, as a teacher at that point where they're all just focused, and you're like, yeah. And I'm like, oh my gosh, right? And I would have taken Edmund, and I would have recommended him for special ed or something, right? Edmund saying crack in the middle of class was the equivalent of Einstein saying he was riding a light beam in outer space. But by understanding that he was that astute about the experience, that I could find a way to connect that back to the discipline, has created a scientist today. And that cannot be an anomaly. And that can be the norm. Now, will some kids falter? Perhaps. But will more kids be scientists? Absolutely. Just looking at time. Now, what's some other things you can do? And this is just...
I kind of suckered you in kind of through one of the science raps. So I know your perspective on, what you think of the effectiveness of being able to do something like that.
Like, it's just showing, like, where you at lyrically, like, people just sit down and, like, write about science. Like I was saying before, it's kind of different. Like, when you rap, like, you coming from your head, like, you're not always thinking about, like, what you're doing in school, what you're learning about. So it'd be, like, kind of hard to spit a 16 about H2O.
Right.
Okay, I'll describe that. So do you guys know what spitting a 16 is? So spitting a 16 is creating a rap that actually has 16 bars. And he's saying it was kind of hard to spit a 16 about H2O. Guess what happened? We had a teacher. And the teacher was completely not hip-hop. Who here sees themselves as like completely anti-hip-hop? You're like, dude, I'm just so not hip-hop. I don't know, man. You're kind of hip-hop to me. I don't know, right? But he's a teacher of a science class. He walks in there and he says, hey, guys, I have a science rap. And he memorizes it, and I give you my science lyrics. And you perform those lyrics to the class. Guess what happens to the students in the class? Well, first they'll laugh, inevitably, right? Even if when I rap in class, they laugh, right? Because I'm over 18, so like I've lost my cool factor. Right? But all of a sudden, some kid in that class says, you know what? I could do that better than you. And the minute they say that, you say, you can? Fine. Go do it. And in that scenario was a teacher who I had coached with science raps, and then he said, I can rap better than you. And then he went home and tried to create the science rap about H2O. And he came back the next day, and his rap was horrible. And so when I was talking to him about it, he's like, well, man, it's kind of hard to spit a 16 about H2O. Like, writing a rap about H2O wasn't easy. But guess what? Now the challenge, the gauntlet has been put down. And if you can do it, then I can do it. So guess what? He goes home over the weekend and studied like he never ever had before. So he can come back and spit a 16 about H2O. And this is not just for this populace. This is for everyone. Do you understand me? It's for everyone can and will. In fact, and I'm saying this just because of the audience, the most exciting and beautiful and imaginative hip-hop educators that I've ever seen look nothing like me. Nothing. They look more like the guy who said he wasn't hip-hop. Right? Because when I come in, oftentimes I come in with an expectation that I know the culture. But somebody who comes in and says, I don't know anything about this, I'm trying to learn, and I'm going to try anyway, gets so much more appreciated by young people than somebody who feels like they know. And this is about culture, but it's also about science. The minute that a scientist realizes that you have to leave your ego at the door in order to engage a class, is the point where the class engages in science. Where a student is allowed to ask a question, and even if you don't know the answer, you just make believe you don't. Even if you know the answer, you make believe you don't. Because by making believe you don't, you activate, like, whoa, I stumped him. And once you activate, whoa, I stumped him, it's like, all right, Well, what do you do with that? Validate that. Put that question up. We'll interrogate it later. That opens up the place for new possibilities. Hybridized cultures, mixing their culture with the culture of science, getting rid of the hierarchies within the ivory tower, dismantling them completely, and opening up the world of science to a whole new population. It can be done. We have 15 minutes left, and I know you have questions. I think you have questions. So I'm actually going to stop here for the sake of questions. And as we answer questions, or as I answer questions, I can delve through the rest of the presentation. So for now, I am done. Thank you for your time, and let's get into some questions. Let's talk. Yeah.
I know you're talking about creating scientists, but do you think that some of the things you're talking about would work across the curriculum?
I think that they could, and I think that in many respects they exist more apparently in other domains. So for some reason, I was at Stanford's campus recently giving a talk, and they're like, oh, here's the campus, and the whole entire campus is divided, informally of course, between the techies and the fuzzies, right? So that's what they call them. The fuzzies are the social sciences and the education folks are on one side, and the techies are on the other. And if I go to the fuzzies, they're more apt to appreciate art. They're more apt to appreciate culture. And the techies, no, right? And so I think this is an approach that works across the board, but it's an approach that's much more necessary in a domain that has an established tradition of ostracizing certain populations. You're welcome. Yes?
How do you think you can use this to teach kindergartners up through 5th grade? Like, how do you want to use, or how can you use graphs or other such mechanisms to get kindergartners and 5th graders or through 5th graders interested in science?
The exact same way that you work through 5th graders to 13th graders. Here's the fascinating thing about how people learn. The way we learn shifts as far as our sort of developmental skills, right? We expect more advanced skills over time, sort of social constructivism, we scaffold knowledge. But what turns people on to learning is always the same darn thing, right? So we did a lot of call and response in here, right? When I said stem with no root, that was done on purpose, right? Hip hop is call and response, right? And so in your classroom, to engage a population or an audience, call and response. Call and response works for kindergartners or 13th graders, which are college freshmen. Sorry, college freshmen. Right? So there's call and response. There is create a poetry or create art. There is work communally. I didn't even really get into the 5 C's. Oh gosh.
You should.
I should?
Yes.
What are they? Would you guys forgive me and let me go 5 minutes into the 5 C's and then we can just talk later on with questions? Is that cool? All right. Look at all this fun stuff we're skipping. All that fun stuff. All this really super fun stuff. We should be here all night if we could. 5 C's. What are the 5 C's? So I've been around this idea of reality pedagogy and hip-hop education. It's hyper-theoretical. It's the 5 C's. And these 5 C's are these 5 tools that I think we can use that are informed by hip-hop to transform science education, right? The first of these C's is cogens, or cogenerative dialogues. And what those are conversations with young people about their experiences in classrooms. This needs to happen at any age range, including the university, particularly in science.
Once a professor actually asks you what you think of your class, they're floored by the fact that no one's even listening to them. So how do you do the cogen? You guys would be my examples. Is that okay? You are an amazing student. You get 100 on every exam. I love you. You are a terrible student, sorry, but you're a terrible student in my class, right? And you always score 40 on everything, right? You are always the edge of your seat asking tons of questions, and you are always asleep and coming late. As an educator, I have to identify the 4 different groups in my classroom. Students that represent a reality that of other students in the classroom. So I identify these kids that are almost like opposites to each other. I say, could you talk to me about 2 minutes after class or 2 minutes after lecture, right? Can you talk to me for 2 minutes after lecture? Can you? Can you? I don't give them a chance to say yes or no. I just walk away. Because once I give them an option to say yes or no, they just don't show up, right? So I've identified these 4 guys. They're opposites. They stay after lecture and they meet me. First of all, they're sitting there and they're saying, why am I here with him? I'm smart. he flunks, right? Already we're changing the paradigm. Because the kid who always gets 100 sees themselves as a future scientist. The other kid's like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to get out of this class. By them being in the same space, I blurred the lines between who's accepted or valued. And I simply say, listen, in this dialogue, equal turns at talk, no voice is privileged over the other, and I just want us to co-generate one thing that we can do to make the next class better. That's it. And all of a sudden they'll say, well, you know what you can do is you can not yell, you can use more examples, you can be, and the students will give you feedback on what they feel about the instruction, whether it's kindergarten, 5th grade, or higher on. And that process where the students give you feedback about the instruction, it always starts with the social dynamics of the classroom. So initially it's, you know, you yell too much, right? Which is what kids have actually told me. Quick story, I love the story. I can't not tell it, right? I'm teaching a class and I invite kids to have a cogen. And so when we're having a cogen, we're sitting there, I'm like, so what is this one thing that we can do to address and fix the next class? I'm a physics teacher, so I'm thinking all physics, right? And the student said, you know what the issue is? You yell too much. So I'm like, I do what? I yell too much? Cogen over, this is ridiculous, right? So I walk out, right? my ego's bruised, right? But I have a next dialogue. I said, you know, what's going on? And they said, you yell too much. You yell too much. And it got to the point where one young lady in the classroom actually videotaped the class over the course of a week of me yelling. And it was a 1 minute and 30-second vignette of me yelling in different outfits. So it was like, you know. And it's just like, you know, the one thing I want to address is that you're yelling. And I'm like, no, I don't. She's like, wait a second. And she, you know, and it's like me, and like, okay, maybe we have a bit of a yelling issue, you know, right? So now, by creating that scenario, right, all the students agree to that. I say, what can we do to address this in the next class? Well, you know what? Next time you're about to yell, I'm going to tap on the table, and I'm going to give you eye contact. And all 4 of those students agreed, right? So next class comes in, you have no homework. And I say, where's your homework? You mean another time this week you have no homework? I mean, and then it's like, right? And all of a sudden, I gauge myself. I take a step back, I stop yelling. And all of a sudden, those 4 kids are like, oh yeah, right? I transform the social dynamic in the classroom. I empower those 4 students. And now that I've empowered those 4 students, guess what? They feel like they're part of the classroom, don't they? And they feel like they can inform what's going on. And all of a sudden, I also become a better teacher. So that's the cogenerative dialogue. Now, you have a cogenerative dialogue. Initially, it's you yell too much. It's you only pay attention to a certain group. It's a whole bunch of different things. And as soon as you address the social dynamics in the classroom, because the nature of young people is that they always want to complain, guess what happens when you address all the yelling and the talking and the way you stand? Guess what's left? Guess what's left? The darn subject's left. We didn't understand how you described that concept. What exactly do you mean when you said dioxide? When you address the social dynamics, the space gets opened up for them to have conversations about the content. If you start with the content first, you'll never get there. And we're doing a bunch of things at the same time. 1, we're empowering young people. 2, we're addressing the classroom issues. 3, you're making the teacher a better pedagogue. 4, you're addressing the content. Win-win. Just dialogue. And over time, you could actually have, once you have 3 of these sessions, because you know every consistent pattern action becomes a ritual. You have to do this at least 3 times. The 4th time, you ask one kid, you know, could you opt out and just invite somebody else in? So the teacher doesn't have to start pleading with kids to join the dialogue. So the kids actually become the ones who invite a peer in. And we have this consistent process of conversation about classroom. In an academic year, you get all those kids to feel like they are chemists. First C. Ready for the second C? Second C, co-teaching. What's co-teaching? Now, the education majors and the former teachers know what it is, conventionally, where it's like you have one teacher and then the other teacher gives you the copies and gets the coffee. I'm not talking about that version, right? I'm talking about a version of co-teaching where the students become the teachers. Research has told us from the beginning of time that people learn more by teaching than from learning. Yet the structures of schooling, particularly in science classrooms, is always unidirectional. I teach you, you soak in, you spit back later. If you want kids to engage in science, give them the opportunity to teach. How do you do that? Give them your lesson plan template. Give them the access to the teacher's manual. Give them access to all the resources that you use to create your lesson. Have them come back and create a lesson plan. And then have them teach the class. And you sit where the student will have sat. And if you want attention, you raise your hand. First of all, you learn how it feels, right? Right? But if you want attention, you raise your hand. And you don't ever let them, you never interrupt unless the content is off. But otherwise, you let them sink or swim. And you create a process where kids are teaching and learning. And guess what happens when 2 students are up there teaching? Everybody else wants a chance to teach. And once everybody else wants a chance to teach, they reimagine themselves as scientists because they're now science teachers. And once they're science teachers, they're just about scientists. Co-teaching. It's simple. The third C, cosmopolitanism. Creating a familial structure in the classroom where students feel like that class is like their family. Cosmopolitanism it's like an emotional dimension. It's like creating a family surrounding the classroom. In the United States today, the absence of nuclear families has been the cause for increased crime and increased gangs in a lot of communities. And what gangs do well that educators don't is they're cosmopolitan. Every gang has everyone in the gang have a role. This is what you do, this is what you do, this is what you do, this is what you do. And every gang has their own distinct handshake. Anybody ever seen a gang handshake? Raise your hands if you've seen a gang handshake. 1 person, 2 people, 3, 4. Gang handshakes last 7 minutes. And they're just like tapping everything. It's like patty cake, right? And you're wondering, what's the significance of the handshake? It's those little things that connect people emotionally to the classroom context. So when you're teaching, I'm teaching a lesson, and all of a sudden you get an answer right. And I give you a high five, and I do, let's add a little boom, and then we go science, and we walk away, right? Right? It's not the conventional handshake, but our science handshake becomes a way to validate when a student gets an answer right in any grade. Even if they laugh at you initially, guess what happens? Everybody wants an opportunity to get the science handshake. It's a little insignificant thing that changes the nature of the classroom, giving everybody a role in the classroom. Everybody has a job, and that job is connected to science. And in the interest of time, I'll stop there, but we'll talk later, all right? You'll find me, I'll find you, we'll talk, right? Third C, I want to get through all 5. The 4th C is context. What is context? Bringing things from the environment where the students are from into the classroom as the anchor for the instruction. We just don't do it. Teachers teach, professors teach about scientific concepts, and it's all images from Google or from the textbook. What does that do? It creates the perception, which is indeed a fallacy, that science only exists on Google and in the textbook. So if you want science to be connected to their real life, you got to use artifacts from real life. If we're talking about weathering, use a rocket they see outside every day. If I'm talking about anything, soil, whatever, use something that they see. Something that once they leave that classroom, once they walk out every day, they're like, oh my gosh, that's what he used. What does that do? It blurs the line between the academic ivory tower person and the real life person. And once those lines are blurred, science becomes part of everyday discourse. People start seeing the science around them when you introduce them to it. People oftentimes critique young people and say, well, you know, how could they not know that? No one can know anything if no one's ever taught them. No one can fashion it as related to their life world if no one ever showed them the example. And so the educator's role, and not even the educator, if there are any parents in here, that's the parent's role also. Show the student the science in the world around them every single day. Okay? And with that context also means giving kids assignments. And the assignment is because you might not be able to identify everything, right? You don't want it to be through your lens. The assignment is, today we learned about blah, 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 blah. Your assignment in class today is not do a problem set on page 152. Your homework assignment is to go outside into the world and come up with an artifact that to you connects back to the scientific conversation in class today. Guess what that does? You activate the imagination. Like you could have been teaching about something on a molecular scale, and a kid comes in and brings in a book bag. And you're like, what the heck, right? But the fact that they bring something that's seemingly disparate and can make the connection back to the discipline is what science is all about. And so creating assignments where kids are consistently infiltrating their own worlds to bring science back in. This is why I'm like, I want to start a new group, and it's called, Bring Show and Tell Back. Right? Anybody want to join with me? Like, all right, I'm all about show and tell. Show and tell is one of the most amazing pedagogical practices ever invented. And by the way, it pains me when I go to elementary schools and there's no show and tell. I'm like, what's going on here? You know, I go to flip a table over. But show and tell works not only in elementary schools, also in middle school and high school. Because what's show and tell? It's going into your life world and identifying something that you got to bring back to the classroom to describe. And usually the best show and tell kids are kids who can take what they describe and connect it back to something we taught. I brought this umbrella in today because umbrellas remind me of rain. And rain reminds me of the fall, and of the spring. And spring is one of the 4 seasons. And in class yesterday, we learned about the 4 seasons. That's like a narrative stolen from a 2nd grader. But what is that narrative? It's making these connections that even a teacher didn't see. And when the teacher didn't see them, guess what the teacher can do? Can steal them. Right? I mean, one of my favorite stories is I'm teaching a class on Newton's laws of motion, and I'm trying to get the point across. You know, I'm working hard here. I'm like, because obviously motion stays in motion, and it hits an unbalanced, unless it hits an unbalanced force, it's like, you know, it's a pebble. I'm using rocks. I'm using marbles. I'm doing everything in my life to make them get it. And they're looking at me like, And so we created co-teaching, and I had a young person come in, and he's like, you know what it is, guys? I'm teaching in New York City. He's like, you know what it is, guys? It's like when you're riding the subway. And when you're riding the subway, the train's going at a certain speed, and somebody pulls the emergency brake. And when they pull the emergency brake, what happens? And you're all like, oh, you keep jerking forward. And she's like, yes, exactly. It's because the object of motion is staying in motion, and there's a force that's created through the emergency brake. And you're all like, oh. And I'm like, damn, right? And so what happens next period? I walk in, I'm like, guys, let's talk about Newton's laws of motion. You see, it's like when you're riding the train, you know, right? Because no matter where you are as an educator, whether it's a kindergarten teacher or a college professor, the young people who are sitting next to each other are always the experts in how to disseminate the information. You may be the expert in the content. You know more than they do. I'm not saying you're useless. You're valuable, right? You're the expert in the content, but they're the expert in the delivery of the information. So what you have to do is create a structure within that classroom space where they have the opportunity to display the ways to share the information. And then you can feed them the content slowly, and then they share it with each other. All right? And then the final C is content. Really? Aren't you a scientist? Yes. I spent many years in science labs, many years trying to get those degrees in science, but content is last. That if I start with my content first, and I try to beat you over the head with content, some people will get it. There's some people in the world who are just gluttons for punishment, right? And, you know, it's like, really, jail? Lovely. Like, I mean, some people really are just gluttons for punishment. And the kids who succeed in the traditional structure of science education are those who have a certain skill. And they would succeed in spite of the instruction. But why do we want kids to succeed in spite of? Don't we want them to succeed because of how we taught them? Don't we? And so what we want to be able to do is create opportunities for them to succeed because of how we taught them, right? And that's what we do with this idea of content. That, you know, you understand where the content deficiencies lie and you let them explore on their own. With that being said, I've gotten through all the 5 C's. It's 5 o'clock on the dot, and I will finally stop, and we can just talk later on. All right? Thanks again. Oh, I'm sorry, time out, because I always forget this. If you want to get in contact with me, my email is ce2165@columbia.edu. Matter of fact, erase that. If you want to get in contact with me, my Twitter handle is @ChrisEmdin, ChrisEmdin. And so don't email me, because everybody's like, it's just so old school, right? So like, holler at me on Twitter, and then we'll engage in a conversation there. This will force you to get a Twitter account if you want to talk. Thank you.